I want to very briefly sketch a picture of the history of public policy making in India since independence, since 1947. So in the first 30, and this will be a very fast forward description of Indian public policy history. So in the first 30 years after independence, so roughly till about 1980 or so, the primary goal of public policy in India was economic growth via industrialization and the alleviation of poverty. And the policy approach that the Indian state used in order to achieve these goals was a socialist planning approach, meaning that the state played a significant role not just in setting these goals, but also in achieving them through the control of various economic sectors as well as markets. So the state controlled the economy, the state controlled various economic sectors, and the state also controlled the marketplace. And this is the socialist planning context in which public policy was conducted for the first 35 years of independence. Now, what begins to happen in the 1980s is that India begins to liberalize. The state begins to progressively take a step back from markets and from various economic sectors. And this process of liberalization, which begins in the 1980s, begins to intensify in the 1990s and 2000s, and today it is a norm. So this process of liberalization that begins in the 1980s, intensifies in the 1990s and 2000s, and finally comes into its own during the 2010s. During this process, India's public policy landscape undergoes dramatic changes. Okay, I'm talking about the last 30 years or so. But the goals remain the same. The goal of public policy remains economic growth and poverty alleviation. Just that the actors have changed, and much of the responsibility for achieving these goals has now been devolved to the private sector. So India has now moved away from a socialist planning context to a more market-based context. And it is within the market-based context that some of these goals, these traditional goals of public policy, are sought to be achieved, which are economic growth and poverty alleviation. Now, some commentators, some analysts think that India has now entered an era of unfettered markets. But this would be a wrong assessment, in my opinion. You see, India is not like the United States, where the private sector dominates the state. Neither is India like China, where the state dominates the private sector. If you can think of these two aspects of any country, the public sector and the private sector, in the United States, it is fair to say that the private sector dominates the public sector, whereas in China, it is fair to say that the public sector dominates the private sector. Both are capitalist economies, but they are very different forms of capitalism. India is neither like the US nor like China. So in India, according to me, what has been happening is that India is witnessing a kind of symbiotic relationship between the private and the public sectors. Once liberalization began to happen in the 1980s and 1990s, the state, which earlier had a lot of economic power and which dominated the private sector, began to cede some of that power to the private sector. Because once the economy liberalized, the private sector came to the forefront of economic activity, and so the state ceded some of that power which it earlier had over the private sector. It ceded some of that power to the private sector.